Well, good morning, everybody. Glad that you're here. I always love it when I get pointed to and now it's time for me to talk. So that's always an exciting time. Glad that you're here this morning. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 27, and we're going all the way to the end today. So you better get your Bibles, get your devices, and get ready. As I said last week, we're going to get on our horse and we're going to ride it pretty quick today. But we got two guys headed in different directions. One's headed towards God, one's headed away from God. And so that's the question I've kind of been asking us in our study, is to start making this list of what qualities do we see in each one of these two gentlemen. And is there something that I can apply to my life and make it my own so that I can make sure that I'm headed in the right direction here. So we're in chapter 27. You got your devices, get to your spot, grab your drink, and let's jump in here. Let's do a quick review of where we've been. David's completely on the run. He's saved the city of Keilah. God has kept him from being trapped. We've seen a couple of different times last week where David cuts off a piece of Saul's robes. And we even saw where Abigail kind of calms David down and reassures him and really sets him off in a good direction. That brings us up to chapter 27, where David decides to go hide in the land of the Philistines, thinking that Saul will not chase him there. So he and his two wives and his 600 men and their families go back to Gath, where King Achish lives. Now, while running from Saul earlier, David went to Gath as well, but it didn't go as well the first time around, did it? He went there thinking, I can have some level of anonymity here. No one will know who I am, but they totally recognized him. And so he decided, I'll act crazy, but that didn't work out, and so he ended up leaving there. Well, he's going back this time, but this time he is accepted by King Achish there in Gath. I think this conflict between Saul and David is becoming very well known, and maybe Achish is thinking that he can exploit this relationship, that he can get David to work for him against Saul, right? So Gath is one of 5 principal cities there in the Philistines. It's the closest one to Judah there on the east. As I mentioned just a while ago, there's really 2 objectives. Number 1, he's trying to get away from Saul, right? That's why he's going to Philistia, because he knows Saul won't come to Philistia to chase him there. But the second reason is that he wants freedom to war against the potential enemies of Judah. And his strategy here, his military strategy of doing this, is totally working, because once Saul heard news that David had gone into Philistia, Saul totally quit chasing him there for a little while. But in order to accomplish his second objective, David must operate somewhat independently of Achish's close observation. And so he asks Achish if he can live in a different city. You see, for a while, David is there in Gath, but Achish is almost daily saying, all right, David, give me a report. Where you been? What you been doing? And you remember this second objective, right? So David's got to do a little deception here, deceiving Achish in order to endear him to the king. You see, he's leading Achish to think that he's actually fighting with Achish, that he's actually fighting his own, that David's fighting his own people here. And he accepts David's word and assumes that the citizens of Israel must hate him by now and will never ever follow him again. And so Achish is trying to rely on this, depend on this. The text mentions the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. And these are all in the category of Israel's enemies that God had ordered their total extermination way back at the initial entrance into the Promised Land. And David no doubt uses this as a means to justify his attacking of these people. Here we see our first big teaching point in here, that we must move forward. Excuse me. There we go. Hey, there we are. There, I got it. Okay. that we need to move forward remembering past times of God's faithfulness. We see, as I mentioned last week, we see David learning, he's growing, he's reflecting on the past, he's being flexible, and he's growing in his trust of God. He's growing in his own confidence, right? Moving forward. I think this is a great teaching point for us. You know, it's sort of like teaching our children, right? As they get older, we don't continually go back to those basic principles that we taught them when they were younger. We are expecting that they are now using them, applying them, and building upon them. And as they get older, we give them more responsibility and higher level teaching, and then more and more and more and more. You can see that, right? There's this term in the New Testament often used of maturing or growing. And that's the idea here, that David is growing in his trust, he's growing in his faith, and he's becoming exactly who God needs him to be. Again, we're seeing one guy headed towards God, and this is one of the qualities of those kinds of people. Chapter 28, hey, there we go, we got it going now. In chapter 28, the Philistines, who have been going and raiding and doing these little attacks for some time in Israel, now officially make war against Israel. And King Achish tells David, hey, I'm totally expecting that you're going to fight with us against the Israelites. And David says that he will. Now, David is putting himself in a real tight spot here, really an impossible situation. If he refuses Achish's request for him to fight with them, he reveals his true loyalty to Israel. But to fight against his own people, man, that'd be crazy. In fact, that's why a lot of people were getting upset with Saul, because he was ending up killing some of his own people, right? David's response seems carefully crafted, very non-committal, but Achish believes him. And Achish seems remarkably trusting here, maybe even quite naive. Maybe he's depending on what David could do, what David could be, but I think maybe Achish has forgotten about how a young boy decapitated another Philistine from Gath many years ago. So the Philistines come and they camp for war, and Saul becomes completely afraid. The very presence of the Philistine army so far north indicates Saul's weakness and the likelihood that they are attempting to isolate Saul from all the tribes in the north. Because he's so afraid, the text says here that Saul inquires of the Lord, but God does not answer him by any source. So we've got to remember this. Samuel is dead. He died last week in our study. So Saul has lost his prophetic source of divine guidance. So this is what Saul decides he's going to do. He sends out his men and he says, I need you to find me some sort of spiritist, some sort of medium somewhere in the country. Now we got to remember that sometime earlier in Saul's reign, he expelled all these mediums and spiritists, as he should have, according to Pentateuchal law there in Leviticus 19 and 20. Yet his men still find a non-practicing medium there in Endor. And so, this is what happens. That very night that he finds out, Saul changes out of his royal clothes, disguises himself, sneaks past the Philistine army, goes to Endor, and meets with this medium. Now, I think this is really important, this idea of him changing his clothes. I think it's quite symbolic. In fact, his robes have been quite symbolic for several events in his life with David here. We see them signifying the end of his reign. So as he takes them off, there's a big symbol here. It's interesting here, the text says that even this medium, even this spiritist, is very hesitant to cooperate with Saul. Even she is thinking, hey, this is a little squirrely. This isn't quite right. I'm not sure quite about this. The text says that she says, why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? This isn't going to happen quite the way that it should. somehow Samuel appears. I tell you guys, this has got to be one of the weirdest, wildest stories in all of the Old Testament, maybe in the whole Bible. And there's been much discussion about how this happens. Was it the medium or was it God that brought Samuel back? We don't know. The text doesn't really say. We could spend a long time talking and guessing about that, but we've got a lot to cover today, so we're just going to go on. Samuel appears in some form of a spirit, and Saul ends up having a conversation with him. Saul says to Samuel that the Philistines have come to war and that God has left him and he doesn't know what to do. Saul's kind of thinking here that he can simply return back to the way that it used to be. Back in the early years of his kingdom, when he and Samuel were working close side by side. It's as if he wants Samuel to forget all that's happened, as if he's saying, please ignore this medium standing here in the illicit way that I have contacted you. Please forget about the various condemnations on my character in the past. Please forget about the way that I have recklessly sought to kill David while neglecting the Philistines all these years. But now, please help me. Please tell me what to do. This is kind of a crazy request by Saul here. But I want you to notice Saul's reply. He has no advice concerning the impending battles with the Philistines. The very thing that the deceased Samuel is saying is exactly the same thing that was said by the living Samuel. Samuel reiterates the divine judgment against Saul. The same thing that he announced when he was alive. God is no longer with Saul, rather he is going to be faithful to his word to become Saul's enemy. Samuel speaks only of today and tomorrow, and the time of Saul's judgment has arrived. There's a little interesting reference to the Amalekites you'll see there in chapter 28, verse 18. We're going to talk about that here in just a moment in chapter 30, where David defeats the Amalekites. And once again, we see this comparison between the two. David's going to succeed where Saul has failed. After eating some food fixed by the medium, Saul goes back to where he came from. Obedience, gang. Obedience simply seems to be the big word for this section of text and the main issue that we've got for Saul. It's going to come up in the end here when we start talking about our big point of our study. God wants our obedience first, not our sacrifice or religious observances. Listen to 1 John chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, and see how this totally fits into what we're saying here. If we claim to have fellowship with Him, yet walk in darkness, we lie and we do not live by the truth. But if we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, His Son, purifies us from all sin. Obedience. That's what God's looking for first in our lives. As we take a look at these comparisons, we've got one guy's headed towards God, and obedience is the number one thing that he's striving for. When we come to chapter 29, we see the Philistine army preparing and marching to battle. You remember, David and his men are with them. Achish has insisted on this. But the commanders of the Philistines are extremely cautious. In fact, so much so that they're saying, Achish, these guys cannot fight with us. There's a huge, huge possibility that when we go out there, they're going to turn on us and start killing our own guys, right? Achish, in defense of David, says, hey, I have found no evil in him. Now that may stir some memories. In my language, I say that should ping, ping, ping in your brain. We've heard that before, haven't we? Right? Ahimelech said that when talking to Saul. David has been faithful. What has he done? Jonathan says that of David. In fact, David has a couple of times asked Saul these very questions. What have I done? Have I not been faithful to you? And here is even somebody from the Philistines of saying, this is a good dude, right? This is a good guy. But he ends up obeying and following these other Philistine commanders. And he tells David, no, you can't fight with us. So tomorrow in the morning, you and your guys need to go home. David puts up, in my words, he puts up some fake resistance here and reluctantly agrees to go back. You know, this was David's worst case scenario come true, right? What was about to happen. He appears to have had no means of avoiding fighting his own people, but God saves him again. Right? This has been a point over and over again about how God has saved David from death. Here again we see the faithfulness of God. What he says is certain and true the very first week that I started teaching. He says, David, you're going to be my king, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that that's going to happen. And here he is again one more time saving David. It's funny almost. Achish thinks he is disappointing David by driving him away, but in reality, he has become God's instrument for delivering David from an impossible situation. Chapter 30. So David and his men, the next morning they get up and they go back to Ziklag. They go back to their home base. But when they get there, they find out that the Amalekites have raided Ziklag. They have burned the city and taken all their wives and children and all the people away, right? They have taken them captive. And now David's own men, for the very first time, begin to question his leadership. Their bitterness over losing their families is so severe that they are talking about stoning him. And David now is surrounded with trouble. In fact, David and Saul are both completely surrounded with trouble. Saul was pressed all around by the Philistines with little hope of victory, while David is surrounded by his own grieving men, and likewise appears to have no hope of retrieving their families. They are both at their most extreme low points. But David is strengthened in the Lord. In Saul's greatest moments of crisis, he had tried to inquire of God, but found that the Lord had abandoned him. In desperation, he turned to illegitimate means to discern God's will. By contrast, David strengthens himself with God at the moment of his greatest crisis. I think this is huge. This particular text emphasizes David's personal faith and does so in a way that illustrates the synergistic nature of faith. That is, faith requires a human response, though it is enabled by God. Even though God graciously makes faith possible, it is up to us to respond to the grace. In my own words, I see this as God extending His hand with grace, and it's up to us to choose to grab it. The full significance of this strength is in the phrase, "It is in the Lord His God." That's the hugest, if I'm allowed to say that one for you English teachers. The biggest difference between these two. David then inquires of the Lord as to what he should do. And the Lord tells him, hey, go after the Amalekites. You're going to defeat them and you're going to get everything back. Now about 200, the text says, 200 of David's 600 guys stop and stay in the region of Besor to stay with the supplies and to rest. Now we've got to remember Ziklag's been burned, so they don't kind of have a headquarters. What do they do with all their supplies? Where do they put it? So they decide this region of Besor, and they leave some men there to protect the supplies and to rest. So the rest of now, David and the 400 are now chasing after the Amalekites, and they happen to come upon an abandoned Egyptian slave. abandoned, left over from the Amalekites. You see, he's sick and he's close to dying, and the Amalekites just kind of cast him aside, left him to die out there in the desert. David and his men come upon him. They give him food and water, and they restore him as much as possible. They ask him, hey, can you tell us where the Amalekites are? And he says, yes, I sure can. I'll tell you where they are. Just please don't kill me. So David and his men find out where they're camping, and sure enough, they defeat the Amalekites, all but 400, the text says, 400 of the young men who get away with camels. So David recovers all their wives, he recovers all their children, and he recovers all of the spoils that the Amalekites had taken, and he brings it back. Now you got to remember how much spoils, right? Now these are raiders, so they're going around from city to city, region to region. So the amount of spoils, not only do they have David and Ziklag spoils, but they've got a huge amount of spoils that David gets and brings back, right? These guys are cheering. They're saying, this is David's spoils. This is David's spoils. But David does something very interesting here. Some of the men don't want to give the 200 guys that stayed behind and protected the supplies any of the spoils except their wives and children. They think that they don't deserve it because they didn't fight in that particular portion of the battle. But David disagrees and says that they are totally worthy of sharing in the spoils. In fact, David does something very interesting here. He ends up sharing all those spoils, all those leftover spoils, with the leaders of the cities that he often traveled to and associated with. And he does this for a couple of reasons. He wants to show gratitude to the people who helped him while he was a fugitive from Saul. He was going from place to place, being fed, being taken care of. But also, this is a little bit political. He's building some policy here, cultivating some friendships, some relationships in the future time when he starts making a move towards the throne. I think there's a couple of key points that we need to learn here from chapter 30. That David is not strengthened by the assurance of success, but he names it in that text, I find my success in God Himself. This is vitally important. David's faith in God strengthens him. You know, there's a certain line of teaching out there that I hear, a certain line of religious teaching that says, if you're truly a Christian, then you're going to have success in every area of your life. Financially, health-wise, mentally, physically, you're going to be a great success. But it gets real tricky when you tackle that in its whole truth, because you have to take the whole thing. If it's true that way, then it's also true the other way. What if I don't have financial success? Does that mean I'm not a true Christian? If I don't have physical success, does that mean I'm not a true Christian? That's the trouble with that, right? And we kind of see that teaching coming out in this text just a little bit, that David is not relying on success whether he decides he's going to be true to God or not. He says, no matter what comes, good or bad, I'm going to be God's guy. Right? I think that's huge here in the text, and something that we need to see about people who are walking towards God. I think we also see another big point here, and this is it. David's generosity foreshadows God's generosity. All right? Generosity in His kingdom. David's generosity in having all share alike the plunder, despite some of the guys staying behind with the supplies, reminds us of a parable that Jesus told back in Matthew chapter 20. I'm pretty sure you guys remember this one. The landowner chooses to pay guys, no matter what time they come in, the time of day, all the same amount of money. And some of the guys complain about that. But the landowner says, hey, it's my money. I can do with it whatever I want to. Now remember, there's a neat little connection there with David. They were calling out to David, this is David's plunder. This is David's plunder. And the same thing in that parable, David says, is this not mine to give as I choose to give it? If I want to give it to these guys, it is totally mine to give. With David, a new kingdom was coming, one that was going to be different from any of the other kings that anybody had seen before. Those kings only took from people, but David is here to give. David's kingdom embraces the disenfranchised. He aids the oppressed. He gives generously God's blessings with all the people, even those 200, even those who were in the cities, right, who helped him while he was running from Saul. In this way, the new kingdom of David, the anointed one, foreshadows the kingdom of God, wherein God shares His grace to all who embrace the kingdom of His anointed one, Jesus. We receive this grace not on a basis of merit on what we do, but on a basis of our relationship with the anointed one. This totally links back to what we were saying a while ago about obedience. God offers this to those who are obedient to His word. I think that's a valuable point for us to remember. So we come to chapter 31, and I've been going lightning fast, guys. Thanks for hanging with me on this. The very last chapter in 1 Samuel is kind of a sad story. It kind of ends the book, but it also is the end of Saul's life and his family. The Philistines are now fighting against Saul and the Israelite army, and they are overwhelming them. The Philistines have overtaken Saul and his sons. They've killed Jonathan. They've killed Abinadab. They've killed Malchishua. Some archers have even shot Saul to the point where he is mortally wounded, right? Saul is going to die. He's fearful of how the Philistines will treat his body, so he asks his armor bearer to kill him, and his armor bearer will not. So Saul kills himself. Death was always preferred to being captured by where the Philistines were concerned, and so Saul's fears that the enemy would abuse him or use his body for sport were well-founded. And this description of Saul's death brings the contrast between David and Saul to its climax. Chapter 30 has just related David's great success against the Amalekites. He rescued Ziklag and he saved the lives of everyone associated, but in contrast, Saul and everyone associated with him die in the losing battle to the Philistines. There's a little interesting side note about Jonathan that's mentioned here in the text. Jonathan here has exhibited a true loyalty to his father, despite the fact that Saul condemned him to death on one occasion, that he threw spears at him on one occasion, that he never believed Jonathan when he was proclaiming to him David's innocence. And this is an amazing example here of loyalty. Jonathan died fighting right there beside his father. Sure enough, Saul's fears become reality. The Philistines find Saul's body. They cut his head off. They strip him of his weapons, and they take all that and they carry it throughout the Philistine territory, showing everybody. They put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and then they fasten his body along with his boys' bodies up in some of their temples. The text tells us that some valiant men from Jabesh Gilead heard what happened to Saul. Somehow they go down there and they get their bodies out of Philistia. They take them and they burn them. And then they take their bones and they bury them underneath a tree in Jabesh. And there they fast for 7 days. The residents of Jabesh Gilead never forgot how Saul rescued them from the Ammonites way back in chapter 11. And now they're repaying his kindness with their loyalty. So let's kind of bring this thing to a close, all right? Saul was unfit as king and serves as an example for all future leaders, for all future Christians, I believe, about the dangers of self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Whereas David is trusting and depends on God, Saul is manipulative and vindictive. Saul fails to accept the authority of God as true king, whereas David recognizes the source of his authority and is quick to rely on God for guidance and deliverance. Here's my big point, guys, right here of the whole text, and maybe for the whole book. Saul's story serves as a warning about the dangers of unrepentant sin and the impact our choices have on our life. So let me add this. I'm always trying to make this practical, and what do we do with this? Guys, we know that sin comes in and occupies a place in our hearts. And so when we remove it, there's an empty spot there. You know, the New Testament actually talks about this empty spot and the need for us to put something back in it, not to leave it empty or alone, because if we leave it empty or alone, the New Testament teaches that other bad things, other sins will come in and take its place. But for us, we need to then fill that spot with something more godly, with something better, with something God-honoring. And so that's our challenge for us as we deal with our sin, to grow, to put something better in there that will help us as we honor God in our lives. Well, thank you for the study. I have totally enjoyed it. Russ Bar T will be here next week starting our study in John. Thanks, guys. Have a good week. Woohoo!